Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It's Monday, February 10th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with Times of Israel founding editor David Horovitz. Hi, David. Good morning.
Hey, Jessica.
Hey there. It is day 493 of the war. As Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu returned to Israel after being in the U.S. last week, he returns to court this morning for his criminal trial testimony. And he also attended what was described as a rowdy cabinet meeting yesterday on Sunday, where it was decided to postpone the forming of a state commission of inquiry into the failures that led to the October 7th, 2023 Hamas attack. We'll discuss parts of that as well as the latest in the revelations regarding the treatment of hostages in Gaza, as the most recently released hostages, those who were released on Saturday, tell their families just bits of what abuses they have undergone for the past 15 months. We'll get into all of that after a quick break. Okay, David, let's start with the very difficult words from Idit Ohel. She's the mother of hostage Alon Ohel. She cried and raged on the news last night live as she related what she must have just heard yesterday, what she knows about her son's condition, about being chained and starved. And he, Alon, actually has several injuries that have not been taken care of for all this time. What were your thoughts as you were watching that on TV last night?
It was heartbreaking and terrible and unbearable to watch. And if it's unbearable to watch, what on earth is this mother and her family, and by the way, many, many, many dozens of others going through? But it was acute because of the immediacy. Because what she was describing was a reality in which her son, who turns 24 today, was hours earlier next to two people who are now free. That's what she had just, really, she said, I've just been told, I've just found out. And we're talking about Sharabi and Levy. So they were released on Shabbat morning. And now that they are out, they have conveyed to her that they were held with her son. In other words, these people who are here were with her son. They were in touching distance of her son, who she didn't even know was alive until yesterday. She didn't know for sure was alive. This was the first proof that she had that he was alive. And she said things that nobody could not say in her position, including, this is impossible. This cannot go on. The world needs to turn upside down. Alon and all the other hostages have to be out tomorrow. And she also raged at what she called the selection, whereby we're in the first phase of a hostage deal, which lasts 42 days, and every few days, every week, most of the time, on one occasion, 4 hostages are coming out, and these are the first of the 33 hostages who are being released. So we're a little more than halfway through this process now, and their names were on a list that Israel compiled. And she said, how can the state of Israel, how can the government of Israel have engaged in this selection? They gave the names, and these are ostensibly humanitarian cases, she says. Why is Alon not a humanitarian case? He's
with 3 injuries.
He's injured, and he's losing the sight in one eye, and they're not being treated. And these, again, things that she had just learned. I just understand she didn't even know he was alive, and now he's alive, and he was with these people who she can now see. And she said, he should be here alongside Eli or with me, and the whole country has to rise up, and the world has to rise up. And it was heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. And I can't imagine that anybody who watched it would have not been affected by it. At the same time, of course, there are people in the government, some of whom take a radically different view. Bezalel Smotrich is the most prominent example, I suppose, in basically asserting that the families of the hostages are kind of skewing the national mindset and are, by their entreaties, are trying to push the Prime Minister into taking steps that, in Smotrich's view, he shouldn't take. I mean, this has been a terrible, terrible process and nightmare most especially for the hostages themselves and their closest, most beloved ones, but for the nation as a whole. And this is, of course, exactly what Hamas had in mind when it abducted them and is treating them. It is absolutely obvious in terrible miscare. And again, she said, and I think this has been a common theme from many of the families, especially in the last couple of days. Why is Israel? Why is the government of Israel? Why are officials in Israel surprised and, I mean, outraged for sure, but why this sense of surprise at the terrible treatment of the hostages and how skeletal the three men who were released on Shabbat looked? The families have been saying, well, you know this, and we've told families of released hostages, we've told you this, and released hostages themselves, we've described these conditions. Don't think that this was some kind of revelatory appearance on Shabbat. People are being starved there, the men especially, as Idit Ohel said yesterday.
And as we've seen. The message, just to refer back to what you were saying about the hostage families, the message as each family gives a statement at the hospital where their loved one is being cared for, the very clear message that's being given is to the nation to go out and to protest and to make sure that as the hostage, for instance, the hostage forum is calling for everyone to be released in this first stage. That is what they are pushing for. And as we know, by covering the news, that certainly does not at all seem like what could possibly happen. Netanyahu is now back in Israel, and it seems somewhat clear from his statements that he's not really even pushing for the second stage of the ceasefire. And what I keep on trying to understand is, and I wanted to ask you this, David, is, so on one hand, it seems that Netanyahu is emboldened by all the support that he received from Trump during that visit in the U.S. last week. But on the other hand, you have President Trump saying things like, these released hostages look like Holocaust survivors, and we have to get them all out. This is what Trump is saying. So there's a contradiction there. Is Netanyahu emboldened by Trump's support, but then Trump will push him to bring the hostages out? Where does that lead us, or where does it leave us right now?
So, let's take half a step back first and try to understand why the process is playing out in this way, which is 3 phases, 42-day first phase, and negotiations that are supposed to be underway now and don't really seem to be on the second and third phase. In the second phase, potentially, as far as we know, something like 24 more living hostages among those who would be freed. Why was it done in this way? And not only that, within each phase, and we're all living this every Shabbat for the last few weeks. First releases were on a Sunday, and one set on a Thursday, but it's every Shabbat. Why was it set up this way? Why has Trump put it this dripple of hostages being released?
And on Shabbat.
Right. So first of all, I don't have a definitive answer. I think the very gradual, protracted nature of this was deemed to be, by both sides, in their interests. There's a lot of quid pro quo stuff about the way this plays out. When X happens, then Y happens, including as regards Israel's presence in Gaza, pulling out gradually from the Netzarim corridor, which went across central Gaza, where Israel, the IDF, completed that withdrawal, the process by which Israel would depart the Philadelphia corridor on the Egypt-Gaza border, which is supposed to happen on day 50 of the entire deal, which is coming closer every day. Absolute mistrust between the two sides, and therefore apparently an interest on both sides in doing it in this protracted fashion, and the potential for, I guess, again, both sides to halt this without having given up all their cards. I mean, you've mentioned Netanyahu apparently wanting to leave the door very wide open to resuming the fighting, in fact, insisting that Israel achieve all its war goals before the war ends, and that includes destroying Hamas and ensuring Gaza cannot again constitute a threat to Israel, and Hamas that is leveraging the hostages with every ounce of its brutal and cynical approach, bent on managing to survive and revive as best it can. And then coming to the specifics of your question, I don't know that there's a contradiction. I think we need to see, obviously, how it plays out. I don't hear Donald Trump saying, these people have to come out, and therefore, Netanyahu, you need to do A, B, and C. I hear Trump saying, these people have to come out, and pretty soon at some stage, we're going to lose patience. I don't think that that's directed at Netanyahu. If you listen to Trump, who says lots of things very often, with sometimes significant and sometimes more nuanced changes, but nonetheless, that his theme has been, Israel win the war, then we're going to take over Gaza, and Hamas is not going to survive. Hamas is not coming back, as he put it yesterday. I'm paraphrasing, not quoting directly. Well, Hamas hasn't quite gone, to put it mildly, as we can see. But in Trump's vision, Israel wins the war, all the hostages get out, and then the United States takes over. I don't hear, and I haven't heard from Trump, and therefore, Prime Minister, you whatever it takes, including ending the war right away to get these hostages out. No, he's saying these hostages have to come out. We're going to lose patience, and that's with Hamas that he's talking about.
Right. Let's take a quick break and continue this when we come back. So stay with us. Okay, and then to go into the sort of the politics of the moment, Netanyahu returns home. On Sunday, he's back at work at the Knesset. There's this very intensive cabinet meeting that we reported upon where they were discussing this ongoing conversation really about forming a state commission of inquiry into the failures that led to the October 7th, 2023 Hamas attack. And it was decided to push off the decision for 90 days. Which I guess wasn't really surprising that they pushed it off once again. But are we to draw from that at least it's a discussion on the table? Or are they just do we think they're just going to keep on putting it off all the time and never, ever form the state commission of inquiry?
Well, Netanyahu is pretty adamant that he opposes the State Commission of Inquiry, and the meeting that they had yesterday was, I think, mainly designed to meet a demand by the Supreme Court that this be discussed, and therefore this somewhat removed the sting from the Supreme Court position because, well, they've had a meeting and they'll come back to it. Netanyahu opposes a state commission of inquiry because it's the most powerful such body, and it has the power to subpoena witnesses, and it can issue recommendations. And as one of his coalition colleagues said yesterday, or was heard saying in a recording broadcast yesterday, I'm talking about a Knesset member named Moshe Gafni from the United Torah Judaism Party, who met with bereaved families last week. And Channel 12 in Israel played a broadcast of parts of their conversation in which Gafni says, well, obviously Netanyahu and the Likud don't want a state commission of inquiry because its establishment means that Netanyahu goes home. And the families objected and said, well, that's not true. Why are you assuming that it's, I'm again paraphrasing, a foregone conclusion? And he said, certainly in the eyes of Likud, and to some extent in his own, I think, but it's difficult to parse exactly. But he certainly said that the sense in Likud is, since the commission will be appointed by the current, or the head of the commission will be appointed by the current president of the Supreme Court, and the commission will be headed by a retired justice, because that's what the law requires, it will mean that it's over for Netanyahu. And again, the families objected, but Gafni was pretty adamant about that. It kind of ties in with what Netanyahu says publicly, which was, and he said it again in Washington, D.C. just now, that I insist on an inquiry, but it's got to be an inquiry that not only half the country trusts. In other words, he's asserting that because it would be judicial in terms of its appointment and the head will be a judge, it will be stacked against him, and half the public won't have any faith in its results. And he wants a commission that as much of the public as possible can trust. And he said, and there'll be surprises when its findings come out. Now, this is all part of Netanyahu's efforts to keep himself and his prime ministership intact as October the 7th is investigated. The objections, supported by a very, very large majority of the country, if polls are to be believed, are that you need a state commission of inquiry with the power to subpoena witnesses, because you have to understand what went wrong to make sure it doesn't happen again, and to understand exactly what did happen. There's no other body that can do that with the power and authority, and therefore the capacity to yield the fullest picture. And this has been going on for a long, long time, and it's an incredibly fraught issue. And the meeting we saw last night was an exercise in trying to kick that can down the road, in large part, I would say, because Netanyahu knows that if such a commission is convened and if it does its work, it is extremely likely to make recommendations that will be terminal for him politically.
So, David, then, before we wrap things up, going back to my question and taking into account everything that you just said. So now he's back in town after this, what would seemingly be described as a successful trip for him to the States. Okay, so he goes back into the criminal trial today, but he tends to brush that aside or look for ways of getting out of sitting on the stand. And we're still in the midst of this first stage of the ceasefire, with hostages still slated to come home, presumably again this weekend. Where does that put us today, Monday, in terms of the country, in terms of Netanyahu? Has anything in a sense changed? Or are we basically in the same spot we were last Monday?
Well, I think the visit was, extremely interesting, and depending on how the Trump vision, as unveiled and restated almost every day, plays out, it's pretty dramatic. There have been, as I said, there have been sort of some nuanced changes, but the bottom line is that Trump keeps restating that America is going to take over. He used the word buy and own. I think he said own before. I hadn't heard him say, it was going to buy. I don't quite know what that means. But again, it's the language of a real estate transaction. And he's been pretty adamant that all Gazans are going to leave. There are more Gazans than he has said. He speaks of 1.7, 1.8 million, and most estimates are several hundred thousand higher, but he's talked about all Gazans being permanently relocated. I haven't heard him. I've heard other people saying, no, he didn't mean it. His spokesperson has said, he's talking about temporary relocation. Netanyahu has talked about the potential for Gazans to return after a screening and after forswearing terrorism. But Trump is pretty adamant on this vision, and it's incredibly dramatic. Netanyahu said on his return, the Trump proposal is a whole different approach. He'd said something similar before, but he was explicit last night in saying that, all the previous suggestions included things like the PLO or the PA having a role in post-war Gaza. This is much better for Israel and yields all kinds of other possibilities, he said. Maybe he's thinking about normalization with Saudi Arabia, but of course he's annoyed the Saudis somewhat by suggesting initially in a kind of offhand remark that Saudi Arabia, if it's so critical and so wants the Palestinians to have a state, well, it's a big country, maybe they can accommodate Palestinian statehood there, which did not go down terribly well in Riyadh. So it's an emboldened Netanyahu. It's a Netanyahu who was incredibly supported by Donald Trump. I'm sure we've talked about this before on the podcast, but the opening session together of them at the Oval Office, Netanyahu has thought this would be like a very brief encounter with the press, and then the main press conference would follow. But in fact, it was a 15-minute session in which, at the beginning, Netanyahu was kept saying, "Well, I think that's enough now, and we should go and have our talks." And Trump just kept going, and both in that event and at the press conference was taking positions that were surprising to Netanyahu in what he said, in some cases surprising to Netanyahu in what he said were to his delighted surprise. In other words, Trump was saying things that Netanyahu, I don't think, had completely expected him to say, and that Netanyahu was very happy about. So I think things have changed in the last week, and I think the sight of those three emaciated hostages, I don't think anybody needed the reminder of what Hamas is and what it does and what it stands for. But evidently some people did, because it was deemed to be shocking and outrageous. Everything about what Hamas has done. And that predates October the 7th. This is a death cult terrorist organization that is bent on destroying Israel. Nobody should be surprised by any depths to which it sinks, but every time it shocks and outrages again.
Thanks for the reminder. Thank you, David, for your words and explanations and comments. It's been good to hear from you today.
Thanks, Jessica.
And thanks to you for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. We'll be back again tomorrow with another installment. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. Any comments you have, you can always email us, podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next time, take care. Have yourselves a good week.